also, as well as being recorded, we will be
Thank
making
you,
notes from
Peter.
this
Let's just
meeting
hope the
and
technology
will
holds
be
up. As
contributing
usual with
to
these things,
an
it's quite
ebook
strange, isn't it?
that
Talking
eventually
into a void.
ends up with
What I'd like to do this morning is
a
to spend
whole
no more than
series,
about
or
15
covering a
minutes
whole
or so,
series of webinars by the end of the
focusing
year.
on
So
the
this is
area
a
that Peter's
sort of
just highlighted,
longish term
which was
project
initiating.
for
For
us.
those of you who were here
So my
last
role
time,
today is really as Master of Ceremonies.
Peter
I'm very
did some
pleased
work
that my
on
colleague
that
Tony Waring is
deciding
going to be doing the
phase,
bulk of the
which is really
presentation.
about
So
deciding
let's
just to
get
get
started, and
started.
I can
Now,
welcome
this
Tony to come
initiating
and
phase,
join us,
we recognise that there's
and
quite a lot of
look forward to hearing
persuading
from you. Thank you. Over to you,
which may be
Tony.
necessary. So we're going to focus on this area we've called initiating, and really focus on just 3 areas for today. Want to really share some ideas, give you the opportunity to think about some things, and recognize that there may well be some different skills and approaches which will help make progress in your move towards new ways of working. Working from the left-hand side, we're going to focus just a little bit on stakeholders, how you might manage your stakeholders, how you might recognize those that are going to help you, those that are going to do possibly less than help you, and how you might deal with that. So we'll offer a thinking tool there. In the center, we've got a tab which is called Business Data. We spent quite a lot of time in the last webinar talking about business data, things like the balanced scorecard, for example. And that part will simply be a reminder that unless you do that piece of homework, you're unlikely to do what you probably have to do, which is to persuade your top team that what you're talking about is a really good idea. So we're going to talk from the left to the right about influence, about data that which will persuade people, and on the right hand side about creating something which is sufficiently enthusiastic and data rich, so that the top team are likely to want to buy in. So in that sense, I guess it's a fairly realistic situation. Let's just move on to this whole area of stakeholders. One of the tools we often use, and that's exactly what I'll be doing for the next few minutes, is offering you some tools that you can test out for yourselves, is an influence map, a way of working with a group of people to try and identify where the people who are likely to help you are, where the people who are likely to hinder you are, but most importantly, to help create some plans for dealing with those things. So there are 2 axes on this diagram. There's a north-south axis, which is influence, where you can plot those people who have high influence and low influence in the organization, and in particular in the area that you're looking at, and those people who might be for you, those people who might be against you. It might well be that you have whole functions or whole parts of the organization you could map as well. But for the time being, I'm just going to ask you to think about perhaps people that you know, and if you're thinking about a project that you're about to start, to think about particular individuals. Let's just start for a moment with Jane. Jane's a lovely person, isn't she? She's of high influence in the organization. She's the kind of person who people listen to, the kind of person who gets things done, and when she says something is important, people are likely to accept and believe that. And she's for your project, so she's a fantastic ally. And what I'd like to ask you to do, if you can draw out those 2 axes on a piece of paper, if you have paper in the digital world. And as we talk, just begin to map people that you know in your organization that fit in various parts of this this screen. So firstly, just think for a moment about people who are for you and have high influence. Next we have John. John is also for you, but is of limited influence. Now you might argue, well, how can John help me? He's not going to be influential in the organization. On the other hand, he's for what it is, whatever it is you want to do. So again, if you can think of real names to put in that that space, please just do that. And I'll simply move on, asking you, as we do, to just begin to put some names in the boxes that might help you. Joe is of high influence and is against you. Does that mean Joe's your enemy? Guess that's up to you. That's the way you see it. But it might well be that since Joe has high influence in the organization, if Joe can be persuaded to behave differently or act differently, then he may well be extremely helpful to you. And finally, Jill, who's both against you and has low influence. She's the diametric opposite to Jane. Jane has lots of power and supports you. Jill has little power or little influence in the organization and is against you. So you could argue, why even spend time with Jill on this subject? Because even though she's against you, she's not likely to persuade other people and pull them along with you. So in terms of the strategy, there's probably a strategy which says working in the top right-hand box isn't probably going to help you greatly because they're your friends anyway, but working in the two boxes, one to the left of there and one below it, where John and Joe are, is probably worth the effort in order to bring as many people into the high influence and 4 box as you can. So, for example, you want to move John. Just ask you to reflect for a moment on what the kind of things are you might have to do to move John from being low influence to high influence. He's for you, so perhaps it may be as simple as providing him some tools and some help to increase his level of influence with other people. Not just education, but maybe real tools and real help that he can use. And as a second example, Joe's of medium influence. He's against you. What can you do to move Joe into your position? Move Joe so that he's less against and more for you. And that is clearly an area where working with Joe, perhaps one-to-one, using other people that can help, using Jane. Jane may well relate strongly to Joe and be able to help pull Joe into the fold. So the whole purpose of this is twofold. One is to begin to map where people are. The second is to try and move them, as many as possible, up towards that top right-hand area. You're not going to move all of them all of the way, but any movement in that direction is going to lower resistance to what you're trying to do elsewhere. And that can also be used as a tool for beginning to think about selecting your project team. So if you've got potential project team members, it's worth mapping them on the influence map and working out some kind of strategy for doing two things. One is for recruiting them. The other is for moving them into a position where they're most helpful. A project team of people who is all like Jane probably isn't going to be very effective for you because they're not going to be able to relate to some other parts of the organization who don't see the world quite like that. So really, this next piece is simply a list of ideas of things that we've done when we've been working with project teams in client organizations. And these are the things that seem really to help get the project teams working as effectively as possible. The first one is to establish goals. And what I'd like to do is to underline the piece which says with real added value. It's about creating goals that really do make sense for the organization, but also in preparation for working with the top team later on in this segment to establish goal to show where the real added value is. So you're prepared for working with the top team. Secondly, as a subset to this, build goals with clarity of purpose and direction. That clarity is critical. Particularly again when you're working with the top team, you're working with people who have relatively little time to listen to the arguments, but will be persuaded if it's really clear and demonstrates, as in the statement above, the potential for real added value. Build those goals that are shared and supported. This is critical. Everywhere we've worked, I think we've seen that if you can't take teams along with you, if you don't involve the senior people in the decisions that are being made, then the goals are unlikely to be sufficiently well supported organization-wide. Also critical, you need to measure what you're doing. We all know this. establishing the measures for success also helps to ensure that you set some baselines at this point, so that when you really do roll out your program and start to implement it properly, you know what you're measuring success against. And finally, this is an anti-silo pitch, to organise the team around what you're trying to do rather than the organisational boundaries. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip, wasn't it? The organisational boundaries. Excuse me. It's relatively easy to fall into the trap of saying, well, we've got 6 or 7 operating divisions in our business. Let's make sure there's one team member from each. That may not make sense because you may not have the skills that you need. Excuse me. This is a good time to have a coughing fit. The next 2 slides are about things that Peter dealt with last time. So I'm simply flashing these up to give you the opportunity to think about whether, if you were here last time, whether you've thought about those things any further. If you weren't, to begin to think about those things in terms of your own organisation. And I really want to restate the notion that, as well as watching these slides go up and listening to me talking about it, you're making notes which relate to you in your organisation about the kind of next steps that you might take. The first one is obvious. If you don't learn from others' experiences, then it's very hard to persuade other people in the organisation that what you're doing makes sense. The first question that, in our experience, top teams ask is, what are people doing elsewhere and how have they made it work? There needs to be a fairly thorough approach to understanding how much change that you can tolerate in your organisation, how much change you should go for, what kind of targets you should set. We suggest a number of ways of doing that. Setting expectations, I think one of the key components of managing effectively is setting sensible expectations and making sure that they're met and possibly even exceeded by a small amount. To have clear goals and measures. I mentioned earlier the notion of setting baseline measures, but also the idea of using a balanced scorecard which focuses on a range of measures rather than just 1 or 2. And finally, making sure that when you do make the go no go decision, you do have sufficient support and resource to make the next steps. Otherwise, I guess failure is looming. Very quickly, we talked about this last time. It's very easy for those of us who have possibly come from an organization development background and so on, to find it really easy to put a whole load of measures in that bottom left-hand box. Our experience, and certainly the experience of others, is that unless you can put some measures in the other boxes, it's very hard to make the argument that what you're doing is worthwhile for the organization. And so often programs fail because of lack of effort in, for example, the bottom right-hand box, where internal processes aren't effectively dealt with, where you have rules, ways of working, which will actually get in the way of what you're trying to do. Move on a little further and talk for the last 5 minutes about the top team. And the next 2 slides are based very much on our experience of working with top teams in trying to ensure that they are involved and integrated in the process of change, rather than simply being seen as the folk you've been to. You've said, is it okay to go ahead with this? And you've pushed forward, but with perhaps not sufficient involvement to ensure that they're truly behind what you're doing. And one of the things which works at many levels through the organization is the maturity model, which we're showing at the moment. I'd like you for a moment to imagine that you're asking your senior people these questions. Imagine while we're doing this, that you're completing this activity for yourself. So imagine a scale from 1 to 10. 1 is a highly traditional organization. It's one where people arrive at 9 and leave at 5, and they have lunch from 1 till 2. They always work the same hours every day. They turn up, they work at the same desk. They have probably sit in front of a desktop computer or some fixed piece of kit, and they get on and they do their work, and at the end of the day they get up and go home. Very traditional way of working, where there's very little flexibility for the individual to operate in different ways. In fact, there's very little flexibility at all for people to operate differently. At the 10 point, what we describe as ultra modern, and you may argue that this isn't necessarily where you want to get to, but ultra modern, where individuals have a huge degree of choice about where, how, and when they work. They have a huge choice of the places in which they work. They could be working in the office. They could be working in Costa Coffee. They could be working from home. And your only concern is that the work is getting done and you don't really mind too much where it happens. And at about 0.5 is somewhere between those, where you're going to have a mix of people working in different ways in the organization. You're going to have some prescribed levels of freedom, so that you have an element of control. What I'd like to ask you to do now, if you just draw a line from 1 to 10 on your piece of paper, think about where your organization is now on the scale from 1 to 10, and think where, in an ideal world, you would like it to be. And we found this to be a really powerful discussion point to get senior teams understanding what it is we're asking them to do, but also feeling what it might actually be like for them. Excuse me again. And secondly, and this is the last slide in this section, to involve them in the process of planning. It's very easy to be dragged into a position where you produce a wonderful project plan in Microsoft Project or some other piece of project planning software or Prince or whatever it is, and present it to the board and say, this is where we're trying to get to. How much more powerful is it to involve them in the process of building that map? This is an example from working with a top team of a multinational organization who are moving towards new and much more flexible ways of working, operating in different countries and in different ways. And the little post-it labels simply represent the steps that would need to be taken between the start point of this process, and in this case, the date on which they moved into a new building, and then beyond. So somewhere far to the right, like about 3 screens to the right of the end of that photograph, is where the line ends and where they wanted to be in about 4 or 5 years' time. And as a result of doing that activity, they set up a whole host of working parties, for example, who worked on, and project teams who worked on things like organizational culture change. And on that note, I'll hand back to Peter, I think, having completed the piece that I want to do, and leaving about 10 minutes for any questions and discussion. Thank you. You certainly have.
Okay, great, Tony. Thank you very much. I should appear any second now on the video. So we have Tony looking a bit frozen still, but looking suitably mobile. Right. So moving on, just to remind you where we're at. This is part of an ongoing sequence, and one of the key messages coming out of Tony's session has been convincing the top team. So one of the questions I've had is, how about bottom up versus top down? What's the best way of getting people convinced? And I guess behind this question must be a question of, well, do you want to have lots of employees enthused about?
Yes, I guess that's an unanswerable question, isn't it, really? I think the answer is
influence the top managers.
Any piece of change I've been involved in over quite a few years has always involved both.
Managers first.
And the extent to which it's bottom up and top down depends on the kind of organization you're working with. I guess I would argue that if you can, and I wasn't arguing here, by the way, for top down. I was arguing here for persuading the top team that it's important. That doesn't mean that the top team go away and produce a lot of edicts. I think what it means is that the top team go away understanding that things will be going on in the organization. I'm a strong believer in a little bit of anarchy in organizations, and a little bit of guerrilla warfare from the bottom up, because I think that often helps. And I think that can be dramatically encouraged by allowing lots of pilots to happen. And I remember one very large organization I worked with, where we had at one point about 700 pilots in trying to find different ways of working across the whole organization. Some were starting, some were finishing, some were very, very small, but where managers were given the freedom to go away and try things out. And that could well be an outcome of the kind of board activity we talked about a moment ago, giving people the freedom to do just that.
Okay. Good. I think the implication behind the question was, were you saying, because you was talking about the top team, this has to be top down? I think you've clarified that. Great. Another question is, how do we move people to the top right quadrant?
Yeah, let's just
That's the one where
to the
people are high
for that,
influence and positive. So very well saying,
the system seems to be working.
Jill, was it? But the question is, how do you do that?
Get there in a moment. There we are. Yeah. When I think there's probably a huge amount of strategies. The one which probably works
get back there
best from my perspective is to find people who are your mates, who are already in that top right quadrant, and get them to help persuade the others, because you won't do it all yourself. It's around creating the relationships which allow people to move. That, for example, as I suggested, John, who's already for you, he knows all the arguments, but just hasn't got the influence in the organization. To ask the question, what can we do to help John be more influential? That might be to put John in a group of people, a team of people who are already influential. So he's beginning to exercise that influence. I think if you're looking at moving Joe across towards Jane, I certainly favour the notion that Jane, or one of Jane's colleagues who's also a supporter, gets alongside Joe and works with them to try and get them to change their views. And often that's simply about education. It's about getting them to understand what you've learned through bitter experience about how to make these things work. Does that help? I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's good. I think I was just you'd said obviously it's desirable to move people there, but obviously the question came up. Yeah, we all know that, but the question is how you do it. So I think you've answered that. Good. Another question about the maturity model, which is, do managers generally agree where they are on that scale, or does that involve a lot of difference of opinion?
It's certainly not common they agree where they are. It's not common that they agree where they want to be,
or even which direction they want to go in.
I guess Peter would be the same, because we've both seen similar organisations. I've seen few organisations where the average score has been to the left of the where we are now score. I don't think I've seen a single organisation where that's been the case, but I have seen individuals who think we're taking too big a chance by moving too far. I'm just trying to think back to last time we used this model inside an organisation and picture where the scores were. My guess is that there were two clusters around us now and us then, and they were about 4 points apart. So the us then cluster went from 5 to 9, and the us now cluster went from 1 to 5. So there were significant differences, but they tended to cluster rather than overlap. What should you? I mean, I guess I would argue that maybe you don't need to resolve them.
And so how do you resolve those differences?
That they may reflect genuine different needs in different parts of the organisation. They may well reflect, for example, the operating needs of a call centre compared to the operating needs of a group of R&D staff. And there's no earthly reason why they can't be operating in quite different ways and given quite different levels of freedom to operate, depending on the business needs. And that goes back to the slides earlier about understanding the business needs clearly enough to make sure the right kind of decisions are made. What I've not seen anywhere is all managers, and certainly at top, all meekly lining up at the same score points on that model and saying, yes, I agree entirely. But I think the debate and discussion about it gets them into a much stronger position to go back and talk to their people about what's important.
Okay, good. We've got a couple of minutes to go, so a quick answer to this last question. I'll just read it straight out. Tony mentioned culture. This will almost certainly involve significant culture change.
Interesting question.
Prevent wrong.
And it's also one of those. It's kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's just got a high level of uncertainty, because what you're doing is moving into a different, more flexible world, thereby increasing the chances you'll get some things wrong. If you wanted an entirely safe solution, you would never move towards more flexible ways of working. So I think the risk of getting it wrong has to be managed, because I'm not sure that it can be avoided in all ways. I think the strongest way of just thinking about this, of avoiding the risk of getting it wrong, is to use pilots, is to pilot new practices to involve relatively small numbers of people, and then learn from the experiences, rather than anything else. The other, which is certainly the case of one of our clients, was that they used a significant number and cross-section of employees in the development of what the culture would look like. And that was really strongly anchored in the business needs of the organization. So they started in their case with, what does the customer want from us, and work back to develop a culture which was both sufficiently flexible but also related to getting business done.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're running out of time now, Tony, so no time for more questions. But thank you very much for your input, your presentation, and of course for handling those questions. That's great. Thank you to all our participants for your questions. We didn't have too many comments, but that's fine. And thank you for participating. Those of you who are watching this as a recording, of course, you will be able to see this any time, and you could even be looking at it after our next event. But for those of you who are watching this before June the 7th, put in your diary 2 p.m. Tuesday, June the 7th, which is the next date of the next one of these series. We only show 4 sections in this diagram, but in fact implementing is effectively 3 separate webinars. So there are 6 in total throughout the year. And as I said at the beginning, the notes from these webinars will form a complete ebook taking you through the whole process from beginning to end. If you're watching this again as a recording, you can go to the WiseWork website, www.wisework.co.uk, to get more information about the webinar series, the ebook, and of course any other services from WiseWork. So thank you all very much for attending. Thank you again, Tony, for a very informative session. Look forward to seeing you all next time. Bye for now.